The defined virtual space of a game, beyond a first glance, has been constructed tirelessly through a constant, deliberate environment of choices. Not only that, but this is a space that is continuously reconsidered, improved, altered, or removed entirely, all through situations that arrive naturally within a collaborative environment. Each and every facet is one that has most likely been painfully reworked or reconsidered, until resulting in what is eventually engaged with, effectively becoming a self-contained reality, as these pieces now come together. But from where a player arrives in their interaction, they become familiarized only with what this has resulted in. Because of this, there's a lot of history that is being experienced, but unnoticed, as each element has become, more or less, definitive, defining the entire thing within a unique process that can never be replicated. As it follows this process of constant creation and elaboration, where it naturally evolves through the thoughts behind it. And this is why everything before that point comes to feel so mystical, having once existed to some capacity in a space where it no longer does. The environment of a game is constantly recontextualized, worked through, until the result can be entirely different. What had felt like a natural, chronological process to a creative team becomes a kind of rabbit hole for fans to rediscover. A lot of this information never really makes it past the doors of a company, so when there used to be a lot more confidence in showing off pre-established versions of games, or if this kind of content somehow manages to make its way to an intrigued audience, we get these glimpses into the truly unknowable depths game creation involves. And with that, we get these kinds of specters, subjects with clear intentions, but for one reason or another, ones which never broke the veil of obscurity, once given a significance that would have altered the worlds they were meant for. Alternate realities that have been lost to time. Possibilities that have come and gone, which are left to be forgotten when a certain depiction is familiarized instead. What manages to slip through the cracks then comes to really pick at the minds of those who are heavily invested in these virtual realities. Those who can't believe these things could have turned out any differently. There's a good reason why many derivative creations have come from this line of thinking. We can't help but let our minds run wild around certain discoveries, as they come to imply that something we connect with was once different in such stark ways. We're introduced to these characters that feel consistent with a familiar world, like Fedora Kong, who was prominent in magazine ads for Donkey Kong Land, but was never present in the final game. Or call attention to something else entirely, like Redneck Kong, who only existed in the cancelled Diddy Kong pilot for about 5 months, as far as we know. It evokes a sense of loss, as we become aware of these aspects that no longer define a virtual reality, such as Lara Croft's cousin, Melissa Croft, who was designed with the intention of adding 2-player gameplay into the original game, but once this anniversary edition was scrapped, so was she. Whatever identity she had now becomes rooted in this lack of presence. These characters come to exist in a variety of ways, offering a kind of intertextuality when they become isolated from a final product. The case of Mel is compelling due to this, as a heavily undefined character, only a reskin of sorts, which represented a vastly different version of Portal 2. This was eventually given a tangible identity by fans who wanted to fully realize its unseen foundation, which really shows that with enough time and thought, a final product can evolve so much that it becomes absolutely distinct from its original ideas. Moments like the creation of Portal stories give a concept that was meant to be forgotten, like Mel, a kind of independence. Through outdated promotional content, unexpected windows into less defined moments of production, or even the ability to root through an existing game's components, these characters continue to exist outside of their once intended place. It even becomes quite difficult to parse the intention from the entity, as it's just as common to see other interests conflict with what has been dug up, almost paralleling a kind of excavation, where a context in its existence just can't be found, as these lost pieces are interpreted from an isolated perspective. But stuff like this really amplifies the sense of mystery that propels the medium to another level, prodding at the questions of what an experienced space could have been like, and what it becomes once it leaves a vast, amorphous creative space. sort of transcendent in its eventual consideration as a contained product, always leaving room for this sort of speculative enormity. Maybe we'll leave that topic in particular for another day. But yes, the barrier of creation does pose an almost eldritch level of forbidden knowledge behind it, when it's really just a bunch of people messing around, like any creative venture. But I suppose, from an outside perspective, this is always going to seem a little more miraculous, with all the moving parts that compose it. When considering how things could have come together, it's easy to feel like what we got is simply unreasonable. But what I'm really interested in elaborating on today is the few cases where a team has had the foresight to keep these connections with its past alive, having this conscious moment of where a project has been and where it is now, stepping out of this to reintroduce an element back in, especially with how self-indulgent it seems to be, as it can be considered only a few steps ahead from a developer in-joke. Sure, dedicated fans who keep track of a property's legacy a little too closely will appreciate this, but it can become confusing to those who simply participate. This is why it's an extremely rare phenomenon, mainly because we also tend to need that context of this taking place. Wa Peach is a perfect example. After her designer revealed her online, it was soon taken down. This most likely blew up in his face, since he was giving an oblivious audience that Nintendo must want to keep within its obscured development space. At face value, very little comes to separate these inclusions. Rather than how they may have been considered within a completed version of the canon, they more or less become defined by these eventual changes, these choices that resulted in their lack of relevance.
Ah, Gordon, here you are.
And then all it really takes is that added caveat for us to reconsider a project as a whole, through what these inclusions come to represent, effectively taking them outside of their restraints, to comment on how amorphous an environment of game development truly is. These characters, though they come from all walks of life, within vastly different projects, all of them can be connected through their ability to persevere, when one idea had eventually become another. To simplify, an unlockable is a developer's way of enticing certain actions to be completed. But how does one make a player care about those incentives in the first place? Well, as a process that requires deeper investment, this is where you'll most likely see these references to development crop up, allowing fans to parallel their dedication through access to these curiosities. Honey the Cat was just barely a part of Sonic the Fighters, inaccessible by normal means within the game's files. Her re-implementation has introduced her back into the canon of the series, along with a few prominent roles in its surrounding media. And only after 12 years. This tends to be where developers try to appeal a kind of self-reference, knowing that those dedicated to their craft as an outside observer will be interested. You might get a peek into the production, a look under the hood, or something that directly calls back into its past, with this implication of personal investment, most likely harkening back to an undefined period, where both a player and developer can converse through these memories of just how far a certain vision has come. YellowHead is the earliest rendition of Media Molecule's Sackboy, and that's all it was. Even looking back at its presence here makes this obvious. It's destined to be a simple placeholder, which parallels the project's own rudimentary beginnings. Its inciting concepts, this interest of its physics, and how YellowHead influenced his environment, branched off into a production that became completely distinct from this. And while the systems behind it took on more complexity, so would its design philosophy, until it no longer resembled the original Craft World pitch. Through its development, Little Big Planet steadily approached a vision closer to what the studio now aspired to make, taking its early physics tests and evolving them in their growing interest of manually applying it through input. This foundation, which YellowHead comes to represent, is only isolated further, as it's eventually refined, down into the product an audience comes to experience. The working end of it looks like something from NASA, while the finished product looks like Finding Nemo. Although this quote discusses development itself, I believe it gives a similar idea of how media is singularly perceived beyond its creative process, especially in this case. Little Big Planet became this game where the tools it provided were utilized by both its developers and its eventual players, which helps to emphasize the essential value in the callback character, as an element meant to make an audience aware of its unseen history. A viewer will only see a product for what it is, not what it has become, so this needs to be directly addressed. And Media Molecule very overtly calls attention to this, assuring it remains within the structure of its virtual reality. Pulling him away from this context, and implementing him back in as an unlockable, allows for this connection between its past and present to exist, sharing this with its audience, in a way to emphasize how their own dedication through development creates something so drastically different. And, just a bit of a side note here, I find it very interesting how a majority of the content that exists of this character is just low-quality footage recorded from kids. Kids who are now able to explore this concept through the conscious choices of Media Molecule as they go out of their way to allow YellowHead to remain as a part of the game, alongside these recreations of previous material, which involve the unlockable outfit. It sort of gives you a better understanding of the fascination being passed down by acknowledging YellowHead as a separate character, who's been given an identity tied to the game's past, declaring that no matter how severely an idea may change in its elaboration or perception, it will always remain a part of it. Little Big Planet is a game founded on the exploration of creativity, offering its players this experience in their own interactivity, so it's apparent why they've gone the extra mile to incorporate a now hidden past into its current form. Involving these aspects of its own creation comes to offer a deeper, more personal angle, one that invests itself in representing what creation is truly like, by referencing how extensively things can shift over time. YellowHead continues to make cameos in the later works of Media Molecule. This continued presence similarly references a prior space of development that no longer exists, keeping it at the forefront to embrace this natural evolution of thought that media is wholly shaped through, as it remains through its influence, in ways that only feel obvious through YellowHead's deliberate inclusion. Although this past only distances itself with time, YellowHead becomes a character that embodies the unseen work that always defines it. A situation like YellowHead's is one that rarely comes along, so the next two cases I'd like to discuss, though they're somewhat similar, bring in their own series of compelling questions, ones which take us into an even more mystifying venue of creation, mainly its inception. Willy the Wombat finds an identity purely as an early conceptual phase for the eventual appearance of Crash Bandicoot, which brought along all sorts of early ideas that were, thankfully, snuffed out over time. I can only assume one Butch Hartman failed the assigned task so spectacularly that they ditched the rendition entirely. From a perspective outside of this production, Willy's transition into Crash feels much more natural, although his design has been refined through a series of choices that only feel logical within this contemporary space of creation that has taken place at Naughty Dog. Not even the species was necessarily set in stone, as is evident in a lot of the production material, yet such a small decision clearly reverberates throughout the identity this development has led to, as it now spans over almost 3 decades worth of titles.
Funny, seemed like more.
But then you look later, way later into the character's history, by the time there was a sort of legacy to look back on. Something I've always really liked about the series is how dedicated it is when incorporating as much of its established lore at any chance it gets. So the return of Willy, while completely unwarranted, allows him to exist as a representation of a deeper contemplation on these ideas as they are lost during a development process, letting them be seen more as opportunities for different kinds of elaboration, in their clear distinction for what has been set in stone. But Crash 4, with its extensive list of unlockable outfits, decides to ask the question of what could have been. Pretty fitting for a series rediscovering its footing, as the game both stays faithful to its past, while really squeezing fresh ambitions out of it. This was an aspect of the character that had been completely abandoned, something pre-established from its creation at Naughty Dog, that was now reimagined by the team at Toys for Bob, who is detracted from this original context, yet finds the concept behind it intriguing to explore independently, which has resulted in a wholly unique identity. one motivated by calling back to this, but directly branching off through a separate reinterpretation. As the developers have gone on record to say that, despite what little there was to work with, the challenge to consider Willy as a character in himself, placing him alongside Crash, was fascinating. Given the theming of Crash 4, this makes sense. The multiplicity it's meant to evoke always leaves room for this concept that Crash could have existed in other forms. This alternative history angle is one that definitely inspired the team to take something so indirectly pivotal in the character's presence, and realize it despite that, while also addressing the core of this concept both sides of the creative process can't help but be drawn towards, as their clear passion for the series results in this desire to elaborate on a vast sense of potential the creative process always implies, since it allows a contained virtual reality to step back and consider itself within this vast climate that always encompasses it at a distance, as it allows a contained virtual reality to effectively reconsider itself. Arbitrarily, Sonic the Hedgehog followed suit with this trend, as the most recent title, Sonic Superstars, returned back to the character's roots to a similar extent, but further fleshing out this concept by realizing a pre-existing design. This unnamed rabbit character was one that came along as the core concepts of Sonic's gameplay were being pinned down. And this was really only one potential idea that had arisen just a little bit above the dozens of unused and potentially countless unseen designs that were envisioned, all of which never made it further through the team's thought process. A process that might seem a little surprising, mainly in just how far the scope was at one point. If I had to guess, they were going off a pretty wide spectrum, loosely based on what they assumed Americans found appealing, which we did, for some reason. But at such an early stage, it can be difficult to pin down anything, when the point is to create a consistent foundation. And even if this rabbit had been considered more closely, it eventually became a matter of elaborating on mechanics that the team had in mind, ones which inevitably led to Sonic the Hedgehog winning out above the rest, as designers like Yuji Naka cited a necessity of giving this predetermined spin jump more impact with some spikes. To think of how extensively this has been funneled down, until deciding on a design that would shape a specified philosophy, can feel very unbelievable. But now, by considering a future for this character, a sort of novelty is emphasized in this realization, having been detracted from such a specified context, in which it went unused. Though it's a little more at a distance, as a supplementary, downloadable costume, I suppose there's an interesting statement here, in the way they hope to find a sense of value by realizing this inciting concept, all while remaining outside the game's content, giving its audience an awareness to this, without affecting the contained reality of the game. The rabbit, who continues to go nameless, now exists to blatantly stand out in the context it was once meant for. Sonic Team comes to address how the past is played out through its inclusion in Sonic Superstars. It interacts with a reality it now has no relation to, engaging this audience who is heavily invested with Sonic's history by completely bypassing it. While this rabbit will always be a part of what it has become, it takes this level of attention to show how removed it now feels from what is familiar. Once again, coming back around to the essence of the CallBack character, as something that can feel so detracted, yet so significant, all while creating this isolated perspective outside of this contained reality it had shaped. All three occupy these individual spaces of creation, which have naturally resulted in what is now exclusively depicted, as we come to address them alongside these counterparts that have remained present, those which have utterly shaped the spaces they occupy, to the point of extending past this into a tangible identity. We know these things as something greater, as characters we recognize and feel familiar with. But making these alternate identities apparent redefines their static perception, one which an audience can only interact with. They were simply victims to the process, ideas that grew until they were inevitably lost by becoming something else. And these examples help to discuss how, while there's never really a wrong or right answer, many ideas are just destined to be lost in favor of what becomes final. This is what the callback character exists to call attention to. But by speaking on this significance, we can delve a little deeper into the subjects and what it comes to say about these projects in themselves. It takes a lot of contrasting, almost exclusive factors for a situation like this to take place. But in an extremely rare case, lost characters are not only reintroduced into a definitive environment, but are given the chance to redefine it. We can look at the curious example of Captain Blackeye to see this. Rare is a studio that is as self-indulgent in its history as much as it seems to make an extensive history for itself, which it constantly pulls from, for their titles to eventually become the strong, unique subjects they continue to be. It tends to take a grueling, extensive process of constant, internal reinvention. The eventual presence of these titles were heavily reliant on the Rare team's unparalleled dedication to creation. They continuously allowed these development cycles to change alongside their own intentions, despite the effort that would have to be lost and then required all over again, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do. Just to take so much time and commitment and entirely removing the sentimental, laborial value of this to reduce it, letting it become something else. This is the most impactful form of these pivots we've been seeing here, and in turn, they tend to be the most acknowledged. That is, while countless studios have faced certain issues and ended up with entirely different products than they set out to make, no other company has included that knowledge into the finalized work so intimately. That is what fascinates me about a situation like Rare's Project Dream, and how it transformed through the team's shifting interests. Where it had started as its own pre-established world, a fantasy RPG, it would slowly warp into something they simply resonated with more. Dream started to span between generations. It seemed as though the more its development marched into unexpected territories, the less an identity could be found in its main character, Edson.
Edson, over this time, kind of started to lose his relevance. It's like almost the world was changing around him.
And by utilizing a design during this isolating evolution, it found direction through Banjo. And once they reached this conclusion, the game came together around him instead.
We really liked the bear. We really liked the character, so we thought, can we come up with another game? And then we just kind of took Banjo out of Dream and then put him in the game that eventually became Banjo.
But in doing this, subjects that had once existed, like Edson, Dinger the dog, and Captain Blackeye, were no longer fit for what would now become Banjo-Kazooie. His identity is what shaped its eventual reality, and it became something it was meant to occupy. In Banjo-Tooie, when entering the bar in Jolly Roger's Lagoon, tucked away at its side is a small room that houses a single pirate in a very poor state, one who immediately feels very out of place. He's alone, and is barely worth interacting with, despite what this dedicated space might lead you to believe. All you can really get from him are a few tokens for the pawn shop next door, which, if you've been looking around for them already, can be pretty inconsequential. So, for him to be an interactive part of the game, what's the point? Yet his presence here can be seen as very impactful. Symbolic of what has led to this sort of crossroads players now unconsciously face, given the context we have. His only real character trait seems to be the comically unfortunate gimmick of a pirate with a tendency for seasickness. Kind of a poignant statement in itself, as a character clearly designed for much more seems to have failed to get off the ground. He starts to lay it on a little thick after the fact, really prodding at his own presence the more you speak to him. He addresses the situation itself to bypass the isolated dressing that composes the virtual space, generating this awareness to aspects that greatly precede it. This is because his very existence is manifested out of sheer spite. Captain Blackeye only exists here to effectively lash out at Banjo and Kazooie, literally lamenting how what he was meant to be a part of no longer exists, as he has now been confined to this space, relegated into a less than minor role. All in favor of them.
It's Banjo-Kazooie!
It's an extremely bold choice for them to incorporate what was now ancient history for the series within its sequel, but it's on another level for the character to outwardly establish this environment that eventually resulted in what was taking place. To be fair, this is the exact same room as an extremely gay frog, and the most blatant innuendos ever. So I'm inclined to believe that they just did whatever they wanted over at Rare. And yet, Blackeye remains, even if it is a project we know little about. Beyond the studio's own willingness to share this, it becomes overtly linked, letting this internal story exist upon its surface. As for a brief moment, both properties can exist, even if it's only by putting these thoughts into its players, allowing them to understand just how complex this process is. Even his inclusion, despite its edge and how resentful it seems, is intentional, just that it now allows for a kind of tether to the series' inception to always remain. Although its eventual conclusion feels so inconsistent, this truth that one needed to go for the other to flourish will always come to define Banjo-Kazooie to some extent. Our final subject works quite well as a culmination of everything we've discussed about this strange little facet of game development, coming to bridge the unseen definition of a virtual space with its detracted reality as a contained product, but in doing so, both redefining the narrative it resides within and shifting the perspective of its presence as a whole. All we really know about Morpho Knight is that it was originally meant to be a boss in the unreleased mainline Kirby game for the GameCube. This was eventually scrapped and was more or less reworked into the Wii title Return to Dreamland. This has pretty much become a foundation for the series, which is developed through each successive title. And, after some time, Morpho Knight has somehow managed to go from being a scrap design to a supporting character. But there's a little more to it than that, mainly due to this non-existent presence it had held, where introducing such a concept could only be done through acknowledging what had been lost. HAL has, for some reason, utilized the prior design to create a new antagonist, one that is more involved, to a frightening degree, which goes beyond narrative motivation as well, creating a defiant statement towards it as a whole. Morpho Knight's first appearance in Star Allies is abrupt, and done in such a way to immediately state his importance, as he takes up the role of the mysterious warrior with unknowable ulterior motives from Galactonite by killing him. He replaces him completely. He's dead. And it would be an understatement to say that this character hasn't already made a name of himself due to this. Although he's only had a single other significant role so far, they've already managed to one-up the previous concept, simply by doubling down. As he arrives again when it's least expected, it already shows how the character's intentions are meant to directly shake what has been assumed of the game's world. This inclusion is a vastly compelling one, taking full advantage of the extra-textual perspective it has originated from. This is also prevalent in the supposed level of foresight the studio had, with cameos that became all too intentional by the time of the character's introduction. If this was meant to be some sort of developer in-joke, it kind of came full circle, back into something the audience is now meant to deal with. By the time such a powerful, unbelievable scene could take place, it was immediately obvious what had been happening. They had found a way to keep this character obscured, much like he had been, as a dormant, unused concept, in probably the best way possible. It really goes to show how unexpectedly amazing the Kirby franchise is, with just how unnecessarily involved it is, with an unparalleled passion for its own history. In all of this, the character already seems to be taking up his own space in the world of the series, by what can only be seen as force. Morpho Knight is the most clearly defined example of what I've covered here today. Yet, he is still meant to be seen as elusive. Most of that has to do with his definition as a sort of outlier, along with what this comes to say within the games themselves, as he is allowed this outer context, all of which gives him this sort of multi-layered presence within the game's reality, and that ends up feeling pretty ominous. He defies convention, and gives himself a significance inside of this space he was once denied. Look at what he's done with a legacy character like Galactonite, practically replacing him. He essentially desecrates the past, to involve himself in the future, coming to symbolize a dramatic shift in the overarching story of the game's universe. And trust me when I say you should take that as seriously as I'm making it sound. Shiniya Kumazaki, general director at HAL, has openly addressed the subversive intent behind Morpho Night, commenting on how Galacta's implementation focuses on this virtual presence, only to disrupt it, as it has been created, then prominently discarded, almost taking advantage of the expectations in its dedicated audience, and even its own development, to truly defy assumption. In order to redefine these standards, it would take a deeper reconsideration, one that, outside of a limited context, would seem impossible. Morpho Knight's identity is essentially claimed, and he applies it through his actions, and through the presence this develops, as a character who isn't one, or shouldn't be, given how events, in a long-gone creative process, have played out. He seems to emphasize this in his enforcement over these situations, assimilating these predetermined roles as his own, in both a gameplay standpoint and within a larger narrative perspective. What are we meant to take from these violent acts of deception, as they replace what is expected, and maybe even what is intended? Morpho Knight asserts his presence as something worth acknowledging, worth interacting with, and in this, he makes an identity for himself, fighting to occupy a space, to take back what has been lost to time. He defies the logic of this contained world, to enforce his significance, enacting this kind of twisted judgment, all while teeming with this sort of resentment for this fictional world. It's surprisingly similar to the kind of disruption Captain Blackeye was meant to evoke, although it feels much more intentionally hostile here. His presence, as a callback character, is essentially acknowledged and fully utilized, all to evoke a feeling of uncertainty that bypasses the confines of the games, completely deconstructing its expectations. Morpho Knight's appearance comes to correlate with a period of change for the series, as it not only moves between dimensions, but the implication of this finally comes to alter a gameplay that has defined it since its origins. Kirby and the Forgotten Land, alongside its presentation of the new world it is set within, becomes heavily symbolic of this unknown territory the series crosses into. So Morpho comes to embody this challenge that HAL is setting itself up for, really taking the extensive work they have done and defamiliarizing it, all to create this looming presence, one that promises to keep the series unexpected in the ways it comes to address itself. This transition also marks Morpho as a constant, pervasive aspect of the series, following along in this substantial shift into untreaded territory to emphasize how convention is being left behind, becoming transformative through this larger climate of how this virtual reality is addressed. He brings with him this new philosophy of awareness, leading players to acknowledge a much larger scope beyond the games themselves. Basically to say that for however much players think they know about the games, there's always an added layer of internal complexity, one which they only see fragments of, as no level of investment can separate them from an ignorance to this creative process that it has been shaped within. He calls his obscurity into question. He's here to make the expected feel unstable, to let what was once familiar seem like a false sense of security. Morpho Knight becomes this tool to destroy convention, to show the studio's own dedication to its history, using it to enrich this world through its investment until it can actively bypass it. Morpho Knight disrupts the expectations of a realized space, one it has occupied in obscurity, fully utilizing a displacement his presence creates to engage both its audience and developers in a unified progression past narrative limitations, allowing the constant, intertextual environment surrounding it to now directly manipulate it. This natural progression that leads to a fictional world is what lets it feel lived in, producing a history that is immediately recognized through these deliberate choices in what elements eventually comprise its story, all of which builds onto a much larger narrative beneath its surface. Believing that every idea emerges in the selection and elaboration of others can feel unbelievable in the isolation of a player. one who sees the contained reality of a game as miraculous in its specificity. It only exists in this way because of the natural process humanistic thought creates. Every minute decision leads to an inclusion, a removal, and the direction a project takes might be planned, but can always pivot in the smallest ways. These choices that come over us in such a natural way propose an environment that cannot be recreated. Characters such as these, which are characterized through these adjacent decisions, perfectly embody something so essential, so amazing in the creative process. They can lead us into a deeper appreciation of the processes that we might never get the full picture of. Their very presence goes far beyond their own lost intentions, defying their expectations to stay within obscurity. Despite being out of time, out of place, they have overcome these circumstances, all to show us what will always elude our engagement with these created realities, to remind us that media is as fluid as thought allows.